Hello! Welcome to Why Psychology Matters to College Students. In this video, we will address learning styles. Many college students believe that learning styles exist, and this has been a debate among researchers. Let's begin by defining learning styles as an approach for explaining individual differences in learning. A few examples might help. Some folks report that they are visual learners, and what they mean by this is that they believe they learn optimally by reading or by, say, looking at pictures. And this contrasts with other learners who self-report that they learn auditorily. These folks report that their best learning occurs by listening to a professor's voice or to a podcast or to a radio broadcast. Still, other students will report that their best learning occurs kinesthetically. And what they mean by this is that they learn optimally when they learn by doing. They like to engage in activities that directly bring them into contact, often physical contact, with the objects that they might be learning about. So psychologists can bring some scientific rigor by testing hypotheses about learning styles. And one hypothesis that has been tested is called the meshing hypothesis. And it holds that learning is best when information is presented in a manner that matches the student's learning style. We can think of it as meshing with the student's learning style, hence the name meshing hypothesis. So in this video, we'll take a look at a particular article that addresses the meshing hypothesis, and the article is entitled Learning Styles, Concepts and Evidence. This was published in Psychological Science in the Public Interest, and if you would like to learn more about this article, you can read its abstract by clicking on this link and going to PubMed. As we've done in other videos, when we're talking about this article, we will go through three main phases. We'll talk about what the researchers did, what they found, and why it matters. So let's begin by thinking about what the researchers did in this particular article. The researchers conducted what we would call a meta-analysis. And this is a new word for most of our listeners. So let's define what a meta-analysis is. A meta-analysis is an analysis of other analyses. You can think of it as an analysis of prior research. And these are typically analyses that are conducted quantitatively. So what the researchers did in their particular meta-analysis was they established criteria for evaluating the meshing hypothesis. In fact, they established 4 criteria. First, they established that it would be necessary to group students by their alleged learning style. Here I'm abbreviating A and V to stand for audio and visual learning styles. The researchers also deemed it would be necessary to randomly assign students to audio versus visual presentations. So here we're talking about systematically manipulating how information is presented to the learner, and we'll see how that might mesh up, so to speak, with the alleged learning style of that student. The researchers also determined a third criterion, which is it would be necessary to have all students complete the same comprehension test after they've received the information either visually or auditorily. And finally, the researchers deemed that it would be necessary to test the so-called learning style by presentation format interaction. And here, the term interaction is actually a statistical phrase that most students would not know about. So let's see if we can understand interactions. And to do so, we're going to remind ourselves about something that many of us learned in high school. We learned about dependent variables, that is, what we measure. So in these tests of learning styles, we typically have a dependent variable that is about comprehension. And we can administer a simple test to get an index of the student's comprehension. In addition to having dependent variables, we often can have at least one independent variable and typically multiple independent variables. So in the studies addressing learning styles, we had, for example, information presentation format as one of the variables. And in our simple example here, we can have an auditory format or a visual format for how we are presenting the information to the student. That's one of our independent variables, one of the variables whose effect we seek to know. A second variable might be something like the student's learning style, and this can be obtained by a self-report or maybe a simple questionnaire. And we might categorize the students in our study as being either relatively auditory learners or visual learners. Okay, so now that we have our variables, we can try to get back to this idea of the interaction effect. So let me offer you a definition, and then we'll see an example first in words and then in pictures, because this has been a tricky concept I've found over the years for many students. So here's a simple definition for an interaction effect. An interaction effect occurs when the influence of one independent variable changes across the levels of a different independent variable. Let's put that into some context with respect to learning styles. So here's an example. We can say that we have one condition where we have the information presented auditorily. And in this case, we might expect, for example, that auditory learners would in fact perform better than would visual learners. Or auditory learners are going to outperform our visual learners if the information is presented auditorily. However, we can have another experimental condition where we present the information visually, and here we would expect the opposite pattern. Here, visual learners should now outperform auditory learners. Okay, so you can see on the left-hand side here, we have our presentation variable, and on the right-hand side, we have how people are classified. Do they self-identify as auditory learners or visual learners? Now, these words can be put into a visual format, a graphical format that you see here. Again, we have our dependent variable, as is typically the case, on the y-axis, and this would be some kind of comprehension score, maybe something like the percent correct on a quiz. On the x-axis, we have the learning style groups, and we have a group of auditory learners over here on the left, and over here on the right, these were the people who self-identified as being visual learners. And again, our other independent variable is our manipulated variable. That is, how we present the information that we're going to test for comprehension later on. Again, we can have the auditory presentation style, or presentation format, or the visual presentation format. And we can color code these differently. I've tried to take advantages of colors here. I have something like an auburn color shown here for the auditory, if you can catch that alliteration. And I also have something like a violet color for the visual. So violet goes with visual. And this particular pattern is what we would call an interaction pattern. That is to say that we get one type of pattern, for the auditory learners, where the auditory learners do in fact show a better comprehension level if the information was presented auditorily than if that same group had been receiving the information visually. And that pattern reverses. Rather than auburn greater than violet, we now have violet greater than auburn for the visual group. You can see here that the visual learners show greater comprehension when the information was presented visually, shown here in violet, versus that same information presented auditorily, shown here in the auburn color. So this kind of a pattern is what we call an interaction pattern. You can see a crisscross here going on, strong evidence for an interaction. And this would be very consistent with the prediction from the meshing hypothesis. Now, of course, hypotheses are hypotheses because they can be falsified. And here's a pattern that would in fact falsify the meshing hypothesis. In this case, we see really no differences. For the auditory group, we get comparable levels of comprehension regardless of how the information had been presented. Likewise, over here for the visual group, we get comparable levels of comprehension regardless of how the information was presented. So here we don't have an interaction effect. And because we don't have an interaction effect, this would falsify the meshing hypothesis. Okay? So this is how the researchers were thinking about what the research should look like if you're doing a meta-analysis. Okay, so that's what the researchers did in their meta-analysis. What did they find in their meta-analysis? First, they found that many studies that allegedly investigated learning styles were really quite diverse, and they were very, very numerous. However, despite the fact that there was an enormous body of research, very few of the studies were conducted with an appropriate 2x2 design, which is what we just saw. We had 2 levels of one variable, we had 2 levels of another variable. That's the kind of design you would have to have if you were going to claim that learning styles are for real and they have an impact on student learning. The few studies, and there are only very few studies with an appropriate design, they actually disconfirmed the learning styles prediction, specifically the prediction that arose from the meshing hypothesis. Subsequent research also disconfirms the learning styles prediction, again, disconfirming the meshing hypothesis. If you wanted to look at a particular study that came out more recently on the test of the meshing hypothesis, here's one that, again, you can click on and you can see yet another abstract. And this one directly tests the meshing hypothesis, whereas the other study was a meta-analysis. Okay? So why does all this matter? Well, as we've said before, psychologists are interested in 2 varieties of question. One is applied research. And we might want to know, in this case, is it true that the meshing hypothesis really directs us toward a particular kind of style that teachers should be using? The evidence actually does not support the learning styles hypothesis or the meshing hypothesis. Even though a lot of students believe that they learn very strongly along a visual line or an auditory line or a kinesthetic line, it seems to be the case that the scientific evidence does not support the existence of distinct learning styles. So that's a relatively direct answer to an applied question. We could also think about this more generally from a basic research point of view. Remember that basic research addresses the question of knowledge for knowledge's sake. So how does learning work is a more general question, of which investigations of learning styles would be a more specific kind of applied approach. Okay, so we hope that this has given you some idea about how research into learning styles might matter to college students, and we hope that you've enjoyed the video.